So welcome back to the PolSocPodcast.com Screencast series, and today we're going to be looking at Northern Ireland, and particularly the Executive and the Assembly in Northern Ireland. Now, this is specifically focused in on Learning Outcome 2.2 from the specification, which asks us to describe the ways in which the Northern Ireland Executive is selected and describe the minister's roles. And it's really, really important for me to just outline some of the important ways in which this is different to a normal historical approach. You'll see here the various pictures on the screen here up at the top left. We start off with Stormont House itself, where the Assembly sits and where the old Northern Irish Parliament sat before it. On the top right we have the inside of the Assembly chamber. The emblem of the Northern Ireland Assembly on the bottom left. It's actually quite pretty, I quite like it. And then the actual flag of Northern Ireland on the bottom right. So these are some of the common symbols you'll see associated with this power sharing executive in Northern Ireland. But before we dive in, a few little caveats, or big caveats, about what this presentation is not. It's not a full overview of Northern Ireland's history and politics, which are incredibly dense and incredibly intricate. And I'm not trying to pretend that I'm giving an overview to that, just a starting point. Okay, it's not even an attempt to outline all of the motivations for the different political and military groupings, paramilitary groupings in Northern Ireland, because again, they're also very, very complex. But what I am trying to highlight to you is that democracy looks different in every country, and it reflects the individual unique needs of each jurisdiction. And so while Northern Ireland has elements that you'll find that overlap with other countries, it also has its own idiosyncratic, unique elements that we have to be able to put into context. And what it is, it's an attempt to offer politics and society students an insight into some of the issues that are at play here. And I would very much hope that this would be a starting point. And if you want to download the listen along guide to this from the episode notes page that goes along with this, there'll be a number of positions where I'd be asking you to pause the video and go and gather your own data, your own information, the relevant names at the time, which change very, very quickly, and to point towards some of the ways that you can broaden out your own understanding of this content. And for anybody who's an aspiring politico, anybody who's thinking of getting involved in Irish politics, there is no way of doing that without at least having some grasp of what the situation in Northern Ireland is and how it affects the Irish body politic and the United Kingdom as well. So you need to be able to understand what's going on there. Just to be specific to the spec again, we mentioned Learning Outcome 2.2, how the executive is selected, but there are also other areas where a case study on Northern Ireland can be very, very useful, particularly Learning Outcome 4.3, which is acknowledging differences and negotiating, resolving conflicts. Now, that can be on a very personal level, how you deal with that, how you deal with it in a school setting, but thinking about if people who are intractably different in Northern Ireland, in their political perspectives at least, nationalists and unionists, if they have been literally at each other's throats for decades and they can resolve their conflicts, surely you too can use that example to resolve some of your own. And also because Northern Ireland operates very differently, and particularly the religious diversity in Northern Ireland is very stark, it helps us to understand the patterns of diversity in Learning Outcome 5.3, the patterns of diversity which exist in the island of Ireland as a whole. And for any essay that you might be writing about political systems, electoral systems, a case study on Northern Ireland really does give you what they're looking for in the exam, which is the integration of comparative and alternate perspectives. How does what's happening in the Republic of Ireland, how does that match with what's happening in Northern Ireland? Are there areas of commonality and difference, and why is that like that? And that'll give you a very good grounding on how to approach some of those different perspectives when we talk through some of the titles here. So roughly what we'll be doing is starting with some of the kind of background of the situation before diving into the kind of minutiae, the key details. We'll think a little bit about that diversity, and we'll also dig in a little bit into the Good Friday Agreement, which sets out a lot of the structures that we need to be familiar with, particularly the power sharing executive. And we'll think about that power sharing idea in a bit of detail. we do need to have some little bit of historical context here, and I would be very clear that this isn't a history lesson per se, and there's undoubtedly areas that people will have very different opinions on relative to me, depending on their background. I'm sure I could be attacked in whatever I say here. I could be attacked from either the Nationalist side or the Unionist side as to what I'm saying, but I am trying to lay out an overall sketch here. So basically, the Northern Ireland the jurisdiction resulted from the Government of Ireland Act in 1920 and numerous different changes along the way after the treaty in 1921, in December 21, for example. But it's basically designed as a Protestant state for a Protestant people. It was designed to be small enough to make sure that the Protestants, Unionists in the state, had effectively got a long-term majority, while also bringing in enough Catholics. It would help to make it more economically viable. And there was some very overt or open anti-Catholic discrimination happening, and this is a matter of historical record, particularly in areas like housing, voting and gerrymandering, particularly in places like Derry, and also in the employment, particularly in the civil service. And so Catholics were discriminated against in all of those areas, and that helped to really sow a long-term resentment in what was going on. Non-violent attempts to address this happened in the civil rights movement, particularly the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, which was, broadly speaking, influenced by the civil rights marches in America with Martin Luther King, for example, but that degenerated at the end of the 1960s into a period of horrific violence called the Troubles, which lasted about 25 or 30 years, involving ambushes, bombings and atrocities committed by paramilitaries on both sides and the British Army, most famously at the Bloody Sunday incident of January 1972. You could do a lot worse than go and investigate the details around that appalling tragedy. Over the 30-year period, about 3,000 people died. We're not going to get into the minutiae of that and the hunger strikes and internment, but these are all areas that the more you dig into them, the more you'll be able to find out relevant information. Some of the other key terms we're going to come across are, the power sharing system that aims to bring Nationalists and Unionists together to cooperate in Northern Ireland, as laid out in the Good Friday or the Belfast Agreement of 1998. We'll come back to that later. And we have two other big ideas here: the idea of direct rule and the idea of devolution. Now, direct rule is, if there is no functioning government in Northern Ireland, it doesn't remain ungoverned. Somebody is still making decisions, but what happens is that the powers that the Westminster government gave effectively to Northern Ireland are taken back by that government, and a man or woman called the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and his or her junior ministers make a lot of the day-to-day decisions and put a policy in place for the Northern Ireland Civil Service to operate. And there's been two big chunks of that from 1973 to 1999 during the Troubles, and then again in the early 2000s, although we're not going to get bogged down in the details of these. And the devolution thing here is the idea of taking some of the power from the central Westminster government and allowing local the states that make up the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, allowing the Welsh Synod Cymru, the Welsh Parliament, or the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood to make local decisions for their local conditions. So what's happening in Northern Ireland isn't unique to other areas of the United Kingdom. It's a process that has been ongoing with not a significant amount of pushback, it should be said. For example, looking at the independence referendums in Scotland. So there's a lot of tension within the United Kingdom at the moment, and we might talk about that a little later. Once we get past the idea of direct rule and we have some kind of political representation happening in Northern Ireland, we have different layers of representation in the same way as we would have in the Republic of Ireland. We have at the most basic, the most local level is the Northern Ireland local government with its county and city councillors. There's 11 districts with 462 councillors, so that's a fairly extensive network of local government that's happening. This is all we're going to touch on it to say that it's done by single transferable vote, and they have elections every 5 years. The Stormont Assembly is the most important, really, I suppose, for what we're thinking about, and that is basically superimposed over the constituencies for Westminster, and there's 5 seats in each constituency, making up 90 seats in total. Now, depending on the textbook you read, you might see elsewhere that it says 108 seats, because in 2017 there was a bill passed to reduce the number of seats. So the last legislative assembly elections was the first time this new seat number of 90 was used. And again, that's single transferable vote. And as I said, each of the 18 Northern Ireland constituencies for Westminster, the next level down, which are picked by first past the post system, and there's the fact that we have those two different voting systems in the same jurisdiction is in and of itself interesting. And they're called members of parliament. The MLAs, as we call them, serve in Stormont, and the MPs serve in Westminster, with the exception of any Sinn Féin MP that's elected. And because of their policy, it sounds very elaborate, it's called parliamentary abstentionism. Because of their policy of abstentionism, they abstain, they refuse to go and sit in Westminster, they don't recognise its authority. None of those Sinn Féin MPs go over to London, or at least sit in Parliament in London. And until recently, they also had European Parliament representation. They only had three MEPs, three members of the European Parliament. And at the outgoing, when it was finally Brexit kicked in at the start of 2020, there was one DUP, one Sinn Féin, and one Alliance Party member, which in and of itself is an interesting breakdown across the spectrum, and we'll talk about that in a second. For those of you who know nothing about Northern Ireland, let's just clear up some of the big broad sweeps of some of the terminology. So a unionist is, broadly speaking, usually Protestant, but not exclusively. Most unionists are Protestant, but not all Protestants are unionists, is how it roughly translates. But they, broadly speaking, want to support the idea that Britain and Northern Ireland are part of the same country. Broadly speaking, they think that their religious, cultural and economic interests are best served by maintaining the close links between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And the more extreme end of that unionist kind of community is often known as the loyalists. They're loyal to the monarch, and they are very very vocal in that loyalty. And again, there are constitutional, in other words political parties, constitutional elements, but also paramilitary elements. You'll hear names, the more you read about Northern Ireland, I think organisations like the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, and various other smaller fractured splinter groups from those things who were involved in the Troubles, and working out the gradations between the political and the paramilitary is often very, very difficult on both sides of the political divide. And we'll see that while the jurisdiction was set up in order to have a permanent unionist majority, that majority is decreasing over time. So the strength of unionist feeling amongst the voters, not the individual voters, but the jurisdiction as a whole, there's fewer and fewer people who are identifying as very staunch unionists, and we might think about that later. And any political party that you see in Northern Ireland that has a U, like the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, the UUP, the Ulster Unionist Party, and basically anything with a U, it signifies that they are from the unionist side of the divide. On the flip side, then, we have to ask, what's a nationalist? Well, a nationalist is someone who opposes that same act of union and all the subsequent acts that follow from that, and they think that Northern Ireland should be a part of a united Ireland. Their cultural, religious and economic interests are best served by being part of a united Ireland, and by extension, now, even more importantly, in some ways, that they are part of the EU. And they do not like the monarchy in any description, and they're often known as Republicans because they don't want that monarchical system. And again, just like on the unionist side, there's a constitutional element with the political parties, but also the paramilitary element, the Irish Republican Army, the INLA, and then breakaway groups like the Continuity IRA, the Official IRA, the Real IRA. And again, it can be very tricky to work out who's involved in which specific element as people move in and out, as their views change about constitutionality and about paramilitary activity. And again, there is a kind of a growing minority of Catholics in Northern Ireland, and also a growing minority of people who don't have very strong affiliation, and we'll think about that later. The main parties you'll see are Sinn Féin and the SDLP. They'd be the kind of the more extreme and the more middle of the road nationalist parties. So here we see, this is a very, very simplified spectrum of how strongly nationalist or unionist you would expect somebody to be based on their party affiliation. So on the very extreme right end here, we have the Democratic Unionist Party, which is quite a kind of theocratic party. They're very strongly linked to the Protestant churches. For example, they would be very strongly against liberal ideas like gay marriage and bodily autonomy. So they oppose abortion. And on the far end, we have Sinn Féin, which is the strongest Republican party, the strongest nationalist party in terms of its desire to have a united Ireland. And interestingly, what we'll see is later down the line, in 1998 for the Good Friday Agreement, it's the SDLP and the Ulster Unionist Party. They're the two parties that kind of come together and cross the divide to come up with some kind of agreement. But they have to bring the more extreme elements with them. They had to bring at least some consensus from Sinn Féin and the more extreme unionist parties and the military wings of those organisations, whereby they had to get ceasefires organised, they had to get people on board. There's no point in the SDLP signing up for something and then the IRA continuing on to do its own thing. So while this is a simplification, I think it's a useful simplification as a starting point. Having a look at these maps, I love these kind of data maps of kind of religious diversity in Northern Ireland, and again remembering that not all Protestants are Unionists and not all Nationalists are Catholics and vice versa. We see that there is a very strong divide here between, broadly speaking, on the left hand side of the map here we see very strong Unionist areas, which we would equate to kind of up in the north. We would have north of the jurisdiction, you'd have Coleraine, you would have kind of Newton Abbey, those areas north of Belfast, Newtonards, and those areas are very predominantly Protestant. And even within Belfast, you would see there be certain areas like the Shankill or like East Belfast that are very, very strongly Protestant. And on the flip side, you would have areas which would be like South Armagh, Newry, big chunks of Derry, which would be predominantly Catholic or nationalist areas. And oftentimes these are, literally one street across, or within a very short period of time, you move from a nationalist area into a unionist area, a Protestant area into a Catholic area. And unless you're very familiar with the lay of the land, you can sometimes find yourself caught out badly. Looking at the map of Belfast, you can see the stark differences in those areas. You would see something similar, say, in the Bogside or the Waterside of Derry, where you have Catholic and Protestant areas, and near the twain shall meet, so to speak. In terms of the relative strengths of those parties, you see that in and around the time of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, it's pretty much, in 1997 elections rather, we see the Ulster Unionist Party and the SDLP being the two dominant parties, with the DUP and the Sinn Féin on the top left there getting small amounts of seats. But over time that changed pretty dramatically to now, if you look down through that map, the series of maps rather, you'll see that it's effectively now divided pretty strongly. Sinn Féin being the dominant nationalist party, the DUP being the dominant unionist party, with some SDLP but no Ulster Unionists, and for the first time really the re-emergence of the Alliance Party. And over time, again, this would be a great graph that you could see, for example, in a database question. You could see this kind of graph appearing and being asked to interpret it. So how would we interpret a graph like this if we're talking about political diversity in Northern Ireland, which is broadly analogous or broadly reflects religious identity? So we would say that even 10 years ago, the Ulster Unionist, or the Unionist population rather, was just about in the majority, but have dropped from just over 50% to probably 42 or 43%. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but it means they go from a majority, an overall majority, to a plurality. They're still the biggest group, but they don't command a majority, which is this very, very significant change in terms of the power and how those issues turn out electorally. The nationalist community has changed less. It's gone down from maybe 42 or 43 down to say 39%, but it's still a little bit of a drop. But the interesting thing here, as far as I can see anyway, is the growth in other. Now, other here is the Alliance Party. It'd be some independent Labour. It could also be things like UKIP, but other broadly speaking, non-sectarian. They're not deciding who they're going to vote for based on their religion or their nationalist sentiment. They have other issues that they want to be addressed, and the growth of that from 9% in 2010 to just under 20% and over 20% in fact in the European elections with Naomi Long's Alliance Party getting a seat. They're a growing force, and we would wonder, would that trend line continue on into the future? And it's something to look out for in the years to come. I suppose the big event here, the big mover and changer here, was the Belfast Agreement. There had been a ceasefire in the Troubles a few years earlier with the Downing Street Declaration, and the Good Friday Agreement is the cross-party agreement that we need to get our heads around. Now, it came down to a political agreement that had to be ratified or had to be approved both north and south. 71% of the people in Northern Ireland were in favour of the Good Friday Agreement, with the exclusion of the DUP, for example, and 98% of people in the Republic of Ireland voted in favour of the Good Friday Agreement. The reason it had to be a referendum is because the Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution basically said that the country of Ireland is the island of Ireland. So it basically claimed authority over Northern Ireland. And we had to give up that claim in order to reach a peaceful agreement. Now, I was about 20 at the time. It was one of the first things I ever got to vote in, and I quite happily will tell you that I voted for the Good Friday Agreement to end the Troubles and end the violence on the island, and would do so again. And there is a whole load of elements of that Good Friday Agreement, for example, recognising the nationalists in Northern Ireland being able to have Irish citizenship, and being able to have what's called a border poll. That means that the people in Northern Ireland get to decide who Northern Ireland is linked to most strongly, and whether there should be a united Ireland at any stage. It's not for anyone else coming from America to say this is what you should be doing. Although Senator George Mitchell did chair some of the negotiations very successfully, it should be said. But it's a case of the consent of the governed, that John Locke phrase, the consent of the governed. They get to decide who rules them, and at the moment, or how they rule themselves even. And at the moment, that's a Northern Ireland state, although that might change over time. I would want to point you just very quickly to the role, I think the undersold or the underappreciated role of the woman on the left there, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Mo Mowlam, who tragically died of cancer a number of years ago. And she had a huge influence on that entire process. And in terms of highlighting, as I think we should be doing, highlighting the important, prominent role of women in politics, she is someone who you could do an awful lot worse than go and investigate and see how she managed that process. It's also worth saying that John Hume, the head of the SDLP, and David Trimble, the head of the Ulster Unionist Party, although he was moved aside pretty quickly afterwards, they earned a Nobel Prize for peace for their efforts in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, which I think should signal to you just how internationally significant this kind of conflict resolution was. And Bertie Ahern himself has gone off and done an awful lot of kind of trying to bridge the divide in a number of other countries, using the Good Friday Agreement as kind of a template for what the best way to deal with these sectarian issues where religions or different branches of religions are having a pop at each other, and how people can come together and resolve those conflicts, as we said in the other learning outcome. So it's worth bearing those key personalities in mind, and being able to mention them in the exam, I think, would strengthen any particular paragraph you're writing about this. So to dig down into the Good Friday Agreement very, very briefly, this isn't mentioned on the spec, but I don't think we can really understand what's going on without getting the core elements of it. It's based on what's called the three-strand approach. And what does that mean? That means that there should be cooperation between nationalists and unionists in Northern Ireland. That's strand one. There should be cooperation between North and South, the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive, and the government in the Republic of Ireland, a kind of an all-island cooperation. And the third strand then is cooperation east-west, intergovernmental cooperation between Britain and Ireland, which basically recognises the idea that both Ireland and England, and Britain rather, have an interest in what happens in Northern Ireland, and we want to avoid unilateral action. Now, unilateral action is where one government decides this is what we're doing and that's it, and we don't care about the rest. It's worth bearing in mind that a whole series of cooperating bodies were supposed to be set up. Some were set up successfully, others not. For example, there was supposed to be a joint committee on human rights, North and South, that never really got off the ground. And some of these, ministerial bodies, for example, have been far more successful than others. And basically, it's a way of kind of cementing the fact that Northern Ireland is a really unique scenario where a level of cooperation between communities and within communities is very, very, very important to make the whole system work. The real crux of the matter comes down to how does Stormont work, and how does that devolution of power, the power transferred from Westminster to Northern Ireland, how does that work? So we have two elements to it. We have the Assembly, which is the Parliament effectively, and the Executive, which is effectively the Cabinet. Now, the Northern Ireland Assembly, you could think of it, if you've done Leaving Cert history, you could think of it as a home rule government, effectively. There are transferred matters that are local issues, like education, transport, justice, and so on, and they are local issues that local people want to decide on for themselves. But there are also these international issues, the reserved and accepted matters, and they are things like foreign affairs, defence, currency, trade, the monarchy, and that's not up for debate in Stormont. They're not allowed to pass laws on things like defence. There is no Northern Ireland Army, there's the British Army, and they're all a part of that same umbrella. So they have areas that they control and areas that they can't control, that they can't make laws for, they can't legislate for. But the more interesting element of this is the Northern Ireland Executive, this power-sharing executive. And the whole point of the power-sharing executive is to require cooperation from both communities in Northern Ireland, from the Unionists and from the Nationalists, because the D'Hondt system, which is named after a Belgian mathematician from the late 19th century, who worked out a kind of a fair way of dividing up ministries or dividing up representatives based on where there is disagreement, forcing people to work together, forcing people into coalition. I would suggest, by the way, if you're talking about the D'Hondt system, you memorise the little formula there. The number of MLAs in Northern Ireland is divided by 1 plus the number of ministries held. Now, it gets very, very complicated, and there's a bit of maths and numeracy involved in it, so I have the link there to the video. I'll put it in the episode notes as well, and I would really, really suggest you pause and go and have a look at that video, which explains it very, very clearly, far better than I ever could. But learn off that little formula and be able to cite it in an essay. The other element to this is that the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, the First Minister should come from the political party that is the largest party, and then the Deputy First Minister, who works really very closely in tandem with the First Minister, has to be drawn from the next biggest party from the other community. So at the moment, the biggest political party is a Unionist party, so they get the First Minister, and the biggest Nationalist party from the other side of the divide, they automatically choose the Deputy First Minister to ensure that both sides are represented at the highest level. And that idea of both sides being represented trickles down into all of the executive itself. Clearly there are strengths and weaknesses to this approach, and if you're discussing this in an essay, I think we do want to have a balance between the two of those strengths and weaknesses positions. So what it effectively does is it forces cooperation and coalition. You're being forced to work together. It's the equivalent to your mother putting you in the bedroom with your brother or sister and saying, now, when you've solved these problems, when you've solved your argument, then come and talk to me. You're forced into cooperation. And what it does is this gives the idea, or promotes the idea, of cultural equality. In other words, there's no part of the community that feels like they're being totally excluded from the whole decision-making process. One side might be more influential, but the other side has a say, has a voice, and that's very important for a functioning democracy, and that's something that didn't used to happen. It was Unionists all the way up until the late 90s. And it stops one community from taking unilateral action or unilateral decisions. That means, if you remember going out to play football as a little kid, whoever's football it was, if they got in a huff, they'd say, it's my ball, it's my game, I'm going home. That's a unilateral action. So it has to be bilateral. Both sides have to agree to what's going on for it to work. that promotes buy-in and what we call social cohesion. Why would you follow the instructions of a police force, of a government that you don't feel represented by? They become a force of oppression rather than a community policing force, for example. And this was a big issue, for the example, the B specials in Northern Ireland historically, that you could look into. But it stops. There's less disillusionment and more engagement, in theory at least, in this process. But on the flip side, some of the weaknesses of this process, of this power sharing process, is that it can lead to a lack of decisiveness. There are some areas where you're not going to agree with, and you're always seem to be making compromises. You don't often get the purest or the most efficient way of doing things. It also means that there's not a full-throated opposition. In other words, who's going to hold the government to account if both sides of the community are being represented? Who's going to be on the outside carrying out the checks and balances? And the cash rash scandal that you might want to look into is an example of perhaps what happens when there's a lack of accountability and a lack of political oversight from a strong opposition. So that led eventually to the collapse of the power sharing executive in Northern Ireland, and shows just how fragile some of these systems can be. And if you are a strong nationalist or a strong unionist and you see your political representatives always being forced into compromise, you might see those representatives, those politicians, as selling out their core values, or not properly representing you and your voice. And so there's a whole lot of balances and counterbalances, strengths and weaknesses of this system that it's worth bearing in mind when you come to write your essays. Specifically in the specification, it talks about the roles of the ministers, and this is probably not something that I would spend a lot of time dealing with if I was just doing a general introduction to Northern Ireland. Because it's mentioned in the spec, we have to get our heads around it. There is a ministerial code, for example, in Northern Ireland that basically outlines exactly how the ministers should behave. So we have a list there on the bottom of the various ministries: communications, economy, health, education, finance, justice, infrastructure and agriculture and environment. And those are filled by the Dahan system, just basically what it outlined in the video there. But there's also a few elements that each of the ministers has to agree to, or they lose their ministerial position. For example, they have to work within the framework of the programme for government. The two sides have to get together, they have to knock heads together effectively and come up with an agreed programme. Here's what we're going to try and achieve in this government, what the executive is going to try and put forward. They have to then support all of the decisions that the executive takes and vote for them in the assembly. Now, if you're a strong nationalist and a strong unionist puts forward an idea that you don't like, this is something you just have to swallow. Now this might seem like a strange situation, but this kind of agreement happens in virtually all cabinets, in all parliamentary governments, and it's known as kind of collective cabinet responsibility is the phrase we use to describe this. And there are different elements of this. First of all, confidentiality, that within a cabinet meeting where all the executive meets, they would, they can all say what they think at the time. And because they would have what's called, confidentiality and solidarity, those disagreements are kept within the cabinet, and you don't run off to the papers to say, well, I disagreed with this. If you disagree with it, and if you vote against it, you're effectively forfeiting. You're expected to resign if you don't agree, and someone else who does agree with the policy comes forward and takes that place. The Irish Constitution, for example, Article 28 of the Irish Constitution says the government shall meet and act as a collective authority. So the cabinet is unified in its position, and that stops, infighting, and gives politicians a bit of cover sometimes for areas that they don't agree with. So the supporting all the decisions of the executive might seem strange, but it isn't actually that unusual comparatively. They have to participate in the executive, these ministers, in the North-South Ministerial Council and the British-Irish Council. And so, they have to be seen to be supporting those three strands, North-South, East-West, and within the power-sharing executive itself. And one of the hardest things for a minister in Northern Ireland would be to see that they're limited by the terms of devolution. There are things that they can't do. There's a lot that they can't do, which must be quite frustrating. They can't tread on the powers that belong to Westminster or any other legal agreements. For example, if there's a judgment from the ECHR or the EU, up until recently that is, they would have to be bound by that, and they can't go beyond their purview, beyond their portfolio, as it would be described. So at this stage, pause the video, go off and find out the names of the First Minister, the Deputy First Minister, and one or two of the relevant ministers in the departments, so you'll be able to draw on some qualitative information for your essays. And the other element to think about in this whole process is that there is, the sands are shifting very, very quickly in Northern Ireland, as I said earlier, because of Brexit. When I was a kid, it was the Nationalists against the Unionists, and it was a very, very clear divide. And in the south, you supported the Nationalists, and the British supported the Unionists, and that was a fairly head-to-head conflict. And what I noticed in my others might disagree with this analysis, but when I noticed in my 20s and 30s, because there wasn't this head-to-head conflict, what began to happen was that the Nationalist and Unionist divide broke down a little bit, because it wasn't Nationalists versus Unionists. It was Nationalists and Unionists all as a part of a bigger entity, the European Union, and somehow that made the differences seem less threatening, because there was an outside third party that was relatively neutral in these matters, that allowed each of those communities to let go, I suppose, of some of the more pressing issues that they would have seen when it was just Ireland Nationalists against Unionists supported by the United Kingdom, and that shifted dramatically with Brexit. And the key thing here is that the majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU, which is a supranational organisation, and 44% wanted to leave. So what happens here with this is that people say we want to remain EU citizens, but they're being dragged out of the EU. And that shifted a lot of people's perspective. They said, hang on a second, if I apply for an Irish passport, which I'm entitled to as a citizen of Northern Ireland, I remain an EU citizen, and with all the protections that entails. And it remains to be seen how that will pan out over the lifetime of Brexit, but could be one, and is indeed one of the big sticking points. We mentioned earlier the growing influence of the Alliance Party, which is a kind of a liberal, centrist, and most importantly a non-sectarian party. They don't think, first of all, I'm a nationalist, I'm a unionist. They're trying to improve the overall society in Northern Ireland regardless of that, and now they're the third biggest party in Northern Ireland. That could change over time, but it's a pretty important point to recognise. The third point there is the idea of choosing your citizenship. In the Good Friday Agreement, effectively, what they say in more elaborate language than this is that if you're in the north, you can choose to be British or Irish or both. And the Emma de Souza case that I suggest you pause now and find out about illustrates some of the difficulties with how that whole process has been handled by the Home Office in Britain. And that is going to be a very messy one in the future. And so it's one to keep in mind as a test of the Good Friday Agreement, just how strong it is and how willing the British politicians in particular are to go along with it. And then there's also the position of people who just aren't religious or don't hold the same ethnicities, particularly people who have maybe migrated into living in Northern Ireland, and they just don't care about the nationalist unionist divide per se. Where do they fit into all this? And there are a lot of young people who grew up now, who are of voting age, who were born after the Good Friday Agreement, who'd be, in their early 20s now, and they've never known that level of violence in Northern Ireland, and so it doesn't seem to be a dominant factor in how they choose their politicians and how they choose their representation. And again, this is one of the other issues that will be very interesting to watch into the future. So then, just in terms of concluding thoughts about the exam itself, I can see this very possibly being something that filters into the 50-mark database question, or on the ordinary level exam, the 60-mark ordinary level essays. And so you want to think about those things as a unit in and of itself, but also how it can fit into the comparative perspective, how you can use Northern Ireland to give a different point of view in an essay about either the European Union or an essay about the Irish governmental system and the electoral system, that helps you to put those things in a sharper frame. And so I've got a list of suggested titles there that are worth bearing in mind. And before I finish off, I should really give a very strong shout out and thank you to Catherine McGing down in Limerick, who helped enormously with the presentation of this material and for her suggestions on how to best go about it. So thanks a million, Catherine. I hope I haven't let you down, and hopefully you could take some of those sample questions that Catherine developed there to say, how could I practice getting my head around this material in a way that helps me to really pin down my understanding. I'm also going to pop up a Google Forms quiz on this, just for the key terminology, so we were able to use those key terms in our essays, and there'll be lots of extra resources on the listen along guide and on the episode notes page that I hope you use to help you strengthen your knowledge. So with that, all there's left for me to do is to wish you the best of luck in the preparation for the exam, and to remember that this is just one way of addressing this material. I'm sure there are many, many others that you could do worse than investigating yourself. You might consider liking and subscribing to the YouTube channel and also to the website www.PolSocPodcast.com. And remember, you're not apart from society, you're a part of society. See you next time.